Director of Public History. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Leo Baeck Institute. The institute was established as a collaborative effort by a group of distinguished scholars and intellectuals who, in the aftermath of World War II, sought to preserve the rich culture and intellectual legacy of German-speaking Jewry following its devastation in Germany and Austria. As a result, 3 branches of the Institute were founded in London, New York, and Jerusalem, reflecting the primary destinations of German-speaking emigres. Today, the New York branch also maintains a representative office in Berlin. Today, I have a pleasure of introducing the first of 7 lectures in this commemorative series. Over the course of the program, 7 eminent scholars will each examine a key theme in German Jewish history, exploring how its historiography has evolved over the past 70 years. I would also like to note that this lecture series, which begins this year, will continue into next year and hopefully the following years. More information about that will be shared later in the year. And we are pleased today to begin the series with a lecture focused on politics. Our speaker is Philipp Nielsen. Philipp Nielsen is Associate Professor for Modern European History and the Ada Bozeman Chair in International Relations at Sarah Lawrence College, New York, and lecturer on memory and heritage at the University of Groningen, the Netherlands. He received his PhD from Yale University in 2012. His publications include From Heimat to Hatred, Jews and the Right in Germany, 1871-1935, Feeling Political, Emotions and Institutions since 1789 with Ute Frevert, Staging Authority, Presentation and Power in 19th Century Europe, a handbook edited with Eva Giloy, and Architecture, Democracy and Emotions, The Politics of Feeling After 1945, edited with Till Grossman. His research interests include German political and architectural history, German Jewish history, and the history of emotions. Also, a quick reminder, after the lecture, we will have time for Q&A. And during the lecture, you can write your questions in the Q&A box. And now, Philipp, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda, for the very kind introduction, and Jenny for the LBI. That is an institution I hold very dear and have the pleasure of serving on the academic board right now for letting me talk to you today. So for Markus Kratu and also to Stephanie Ades for helping us with the running of this event. I'm going to share my screen and I have a few slides prepared. And as Magda said, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'll go through the talk first, and then there's time for questions. But please, I'm happy to talk about anything sort of in greater detail as we go along. I think that the brief I received was to talk about politics in the way that the sort of coverage of politics has changed over the course of the history of the LBI and sort of more generally German Jewish history in the last 70 years, but do so at least to some extent also from my own experience within that development. And so in the interest of sort of transparency, I start where I come from. So when I started studying and researching, then ultimately the history of politics sort of was undergoing a term which is called the cultural turn in political history. And I put a couple of titles up here kind of that were particularly for German history very relevant for this, but also the Americans discussion for it. So the idea of Neue Politikgeschichte, politische Kultur, cultural turn, which meant sort of that you'd be interested not only in the raw structures of power in Germany, but the way also that politics were coded, how culture operated within politics, and if there were political cultures, for example, of parliament, etc. so a little broader than simply a very technical understanding that may have been the case when we talked about social politics before. There was also criticism of that, precisely that the kind of cultural trend wasn't attentive enough to hegemony and power. And one thing I can say also now, having spent Sunday looking through 70 years of tables of contents of the Leo Baeck Institute's yearbook, that at the very least sort of what couldn't accuse the LBA yearbook of ignoring questions of hegemony and power very clearly. I mean, understandably, if you think about German Jewish history as a history of a minority. I'm starting here with one sort of early issue, just to give a sense of the breadth, essentially what politics then meant for the LBI, right? Because in the end, sort of even if we think about political or cultural trend in politics, they're very, sorry, I'm just kind of trying to move around other screens on here. Well, boards rather from the Zoom channel. It could either mean sort of Jewish participation in politics more generally, right? Sort of in general German politics, could mean Jewish communal politics, right? Sort of the organization and elections within Jewish communities across Germany, or then also the politics about Jews. And in 1962 edition of the Leo Baeck Institute, so the first one is out in 1956, so this is the 7th year of the Leo Baeck Institute, sort of epitomizes this in the sense that it has a chapter on the fighters for equality. So Gabriel Rieser, as a participant in the the German National Assembly of 1848, right? So here we have Jewish participation in politics more generally. An article on Ludwig Holländer by Alfred Hirschberg, who actually happened to be the editor of the Zentralverein on Ludwig Holländer, who had been the director of the Zentralverein, the largest German Jewish association of the late Empire and the Weimar Republic. So here, sort of internal Jewish politics to some extent. Benno Jakob, who had been a rabbi but also very political, founded the first Jewish student union in Breslau, where he studied so somewhere between Jewish communal and religious politics. And then also articles on Treitschke and Mommsen, so the politics about Jews, right? Sort of in a way, if we're thinking about politics more generally, really the yearbook and the sort of German Jewish historiography covered all aspects of these three. There was a bit of we also see the other thing here, right? It's initially often a story told along the lines of important and mostly men, right? Rieser, Holländer, Jakob, and also often told at this point by historians or others who had themselves emigrated from Germany and often had known either their subjects intimately, as in the case of Holländer, I mean, obviously he's younger than by quite a bit than Rieser, or had sort of identified themselves as having been a part of this Jewish history, German Jewish history that they were studying. I put sort of the Philippsons here because at least there's a little bit of an opening. Johanna Philippson, a woman writing about her family, including one of her great aunts, Paula Philippson. So it wasn't only men, but predominantly, right, we're talking about a history of male politics, so to speak. Now, the brief, and that sort of brings me to where kind of politics really comes in, of the yearbook was stated by Selma Speer in the Jewish History as we see it, in a programmatic article in the very first issue of the yearbook. And I'm going to read this out because the historical study begins by asking a question of the past. Our question is, what was German Jewry? What determined its fate? What did it achieve? And what has survived its death? It is the survivors of a vanished epoch who wished to use scientific means in the attempts to chronicle what the culture to which they belong looked like, the epoch of German-Jewish symbiosis, as it may otherwise be termed. Thus, it is, historically speaking, a short period of modern history, which we have in mind, the period from the French Revolution to the Second World War, or from the viewpoint of German Jewry, from emancipation to destruction. And this sort of, right, the brief here is a larger one, and I'm sort of claiming my first spot in this series to talk about politics, but sort of the politics of history a little bit more generally as well as a process of this. But it's a very eminently kind of political period from the French Revolution, right, to the end of the Second World War. So from emancipation, as they call it, or destruction, right? So the goalposts are politics, and a lot of time was spent and is still spent, right, in the context of German Jewish history to work through the period of emancipation and ultimately also understand how it was undone from the outside, and potentially also sort of there's some misguided assumptions of what the outside meant, right? So this changes over time from the inside. Then the emancipation of the Jews was to be the point to depart for the integration of a community organized on medieval lines into the general culture of the period. That culture itself was in a state of violent flux. The united German nation, which today again is divided, was engaged in a long process of emerging from a series of struggles amongst classes and states. Jews living in Germany took both part in the struggle to found a German nation and in the continued existence until there took place that event that even the majority of Germans today feel as a break in the history, the period of National Socialist tyranny. I want to get into the interpretation, right, if really the majority of Germans felt this way or not. But here too, right, the understanding is a very political one, right? The German Jews who took part in the unification of that nation, on its political struggles. So from the beginning, there is an understanding of that history always already sort of to be political history. This became very clear in some sort of a sister publication in a way to the Leo Baeck yearbook, namely the Schriftenreihe Wissenschaftliche Abhandlung, or the series of scientific treatments, in this case of the Leo Baeck Institute in London, which started a couple of years later, which by now also spans, I think, more than 70 editions, notably published for the longest time in German, and really only started being published in English by the sort of 1980s, really. And here, for example, we see again the focus on the Entscheidungsjahr 1932, so the decisive year in 1932. The periodization is along political lines, and while not every sort of chapter here is narrowly political necessarily, if you wanted to just think of sort of politics of a capital P, it is nonetheless, right, sort of the Jews in public life, which is really about them as politicians. Then Jews as part of politics of the middle, of the politics of the left. We also see kind of there's nothing really here on the Jews on the politics of the right, something I worked on. But then also more general reflections on the sociology of anti-Semitism, for example, or social psychology of the time, laws and Jews, right? Sort of again, sort of slightly more expansive understanding what politics and society might mean and how they intersect. But that was sort of a very typical sort of early way to deal and understand politics and the history of politics, to look at specific moments and then the sort of political action within that. From the late 1960s onwards, sort of two things happen. On the one hand, sort of social history as a more general trend starts itself to be felt. So there are more structural questions that are now being asked. So societal questions on sort of economic structures, like structural history, as opposed to focusing on individuals necessarily. So we have the question of the Jewish question, Jews in German society in the imperial era, rather than sort of the focus on individual politics. And what we also see is both the appearance of sort of a new generation, a second generation of scholars, and also slowly of non-Jewish and often non-Jewish German scholars, and non, right, das ist Reinhard de Rürup is in 1969, the first one actually to contribute to this. So there's a certain opening in parallels. And so I'll talk about both kind of the historiography and the discipline as such. Also the fact that at this point, we can see in larger historical associations, right, the integration of Jewish studies and Jewish history and politics in their fields. So the 1975 one, for example, is actually a collection of essays of a historical convention that was not sort of a yearbook convention, right? It's not a Leo Baeck convention. And the AHA, the American Historical Association, has at least sort of sessions in 1973 on, I think it was enculturation, assimilation, right? Sort of the question of German Jewish history. So it goes right beyond the purview of mostly German Jews who ended up in immigration and survived and wrote about this. So that's kind of the moment of 75, but we still have a good deal of sort of the classic historical politics of like individual people. So two liberal politicians, for example, in 1975, Eduard Lasker and Walter Rathenau, or Hugo Preuss, father of the Weimar Constitution, right? So there's a lot of that sort of not necessarily great man history, but parts of it. When we see Jews in the public eye, Walter Rathenau, patron saint of German liberal establishment. So kind of that kind of tradition also continues. In 1978, so 1978 is 79 is really go into another article sort of where things begin not only to change, but sort of a sea change. And interestingly enough, when I started really working on this sort of in the early 2000s, 77, 78, 79, were the issues of the Leo Baeck Institute that I gravitated to, not because sort of that was the period I studied, but because they started addressing questions that still were very relevant sort of for how we approached at least that point my advisors, also some German Jewish history at the time. And I want to focus in here briefly on Hans Liebeschütz, who's a medieval historian who managed to emigrate to the UK. And he's writing about past, present, and future of German Jewish historiography, sort of how he thought about it, and particularly how he thought about it in relation to politics and the history of politics. So he used this article to think through the way that political history, and history more generally, but really political history of German Jewry had been done up until this point. And he uses two publications, Thury's 1968, Die politische Orientierung der Juden in Deutschland, the political orientation of Jews in Germany, and then Fritz Stern's Golden Iron on the question of Bismarck, on Bismarck's banker, Bleichroeder, and sort of the position of this old bourgeoisie of German Jewry in conservative politics, to think through what he felt were both the advantages and the ways kind of that his German history had been done at this point, and what really had to change when thinking about politics. And mostly he's concerned with the fact that it's written too much backward from 1945, right? Sort of that it's thought of from the end, and everyone tries to trace sort of from the emancipation to the destruction, right? The brief that I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to explain, really sort of find the teleology, sort of understand from the beginning what all had been there already that led to National Socialism and the destruction of German Jewry. And to that extent, often tended to be actually quite, for example, in Jakob Thury's case, quite ungenerous to some of the German Jews in their political positions, as particularly by the late 19th century and early 20th century, of being misguided, of having misunderstood the depth of anti-Semitic sentiment outside of them, or around them rather, and sort of really should have understood, and this is sort of Thury's term here, that what they were trying to do was really an amalgamation, so something that was sort of it wasn't assimilation, it wasn't acculturation, it was really something that couldn't really be forced together, namely Jews and Germans. And so it's a story in a way of being misguided and of decline. In Stern's Golden Iron, Liebeschütz sees something similar in play when trying to see sort of German history similarly like being on this teleological path towards 1933. Part of that sort of had to do with the emergence of sort of the German Sonderwegs thesis, right? So the special path, the idea that Germany in the German nationalism, right? This kind of nationalism that, again, Speer had alluded to as Jewish Germans having been part of and contributed to in their own history, sort of taken a different turn than other Western nationalisms, particularly France and Britain, and sort of missed the curve towards a bourgeois sort of revolution, and then descended into authoritarianism and sort of the Third Reich ultimately, because it hadn't modernized properly. So that's the big part of German historiography, not German Jewish, but German historiography. And Liebeschütz essentially warns against this, and this is kind of quite noteworthy if we're thinking about the way that German Jewish and generally German history are related, since he does that before the criticism really begins vis-a-vis German history as such. So here he's writing about Stern, Liebeschütz, but in this 1978 article. But the main villain of the story is German society, measured by American standards and delineated with outspoken aversion. While the economic life of the nation has grown into a modern structure, its leading group has avoided a corresponding change in its mentality. The basic contrast of reality and ideas favored the prevalence of ruthless self-assertion. Stern remarks that such an attitude was not enough in Western Europe and North America, but he adds that the democratic form of life had restricted its effects. And then Liebeschütz sort of comments, an exact comparison with Western Europe and North America would certainly be worthwhile. In such a comparison between the positions of German and English juries, not only the social structure of the Gentile environment is relevant, must also consider the difference in the parts played by jury here and there. The early development of capitalism in the West limited the contribution of the rising minority and made them less conspicuous. So he's arguing here in 1968 already for a comparative history, right? A comparative history both of, in a sense, German nationalism and German politics, but also of the role and position of Jews in that society compared to other Western nations, very much Western focus, not sort of Eastern focus. In very similar terms, actually, in the way that then in 1984, kind of the seminal criticism of the special path sort of thesis was formulated by Jeff Ealing and David Blackburn in the peculiarities of German history. So I just wanted to throw this in, both kind of to see where the two also relate to each other, and sometimes actually German Jewish history might actually be the one that sort of gets to certain questions earlier than the general German history, which often, and that is to some extent true to this day, runs parallel, right? Sort of they're fields that are overlapping, but often done by different people, still with slightly different questions. Another 1978 article that is crucial within the context of thinking about politics and anti-Semitism, right, which is the other large sort of understandable preoccupation of German Jewish historiography, is also 1978 by Shulamit Volkov, in which she coins the term anti-Semitism as a cultural code. And essentially what she tries to understand here, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this article because I think it's still maybe now again sort of very relevant for thinking about anti-Semitism, is that she tries to establish at which point sort of anti-Semitism really became a dominant factor in German political life, precisely because if you just look, and that had what the studies had done before, the political parties that espoused anti-Semitism as part of their program had actually declined at the end of the imperial period, right? So they had a spike in their electoral fortunes in the late 1900s, late 1800s, sorry, so late 1890s. And then towards the First World War and the last years of the empire really become marginal. And yet then sort of by the 1920s, there's violent German anti-Semitism, particularly on the right. So she tried to understand how this could be, like, how could you think of a political history that wasn't limited to political parties only, yet sort of made a general political phenomenon like anti-Semitism understandable. And in some ways, right, she predates also part of the cultural terms in politics here, because she really tries to understand cultural and the cultural code of anti-Semitism. And very briefly, right, her argument is that the anti-Semitism, as there's sort of two emerging camps within the German political culture, political sphere, one being pro-modernity, emancipation, democracy, the liberal field, and one that, particularly after 1873, 74, Germany unites in 1970, become disenchanted with the new liberal state, if they hadn't been before, with the economic development within it, and then also economic crisis, the rising sort of power of the working classes, the growing position of women, etc. Sort of that this second camp over time sort of adopts anti-Semitism as this cultural code that binds everything together. So it's not as if they're only concerned with Jews, but anti-Semitism is possible, is the mode by which all other things can also then be explained. And it's also particularly anti-Semitism, as it is not simply sort of Jew hatred, it's supposed to be more scientific, right? It's race theories, but it is something that spreads well beyond, right, the officially and self-declared anti-Semitic parties and associations, and becomes sort of this metric by which you can understand political positions, sort of in the sense that there is a camp that is liberal and democratic, which doesn't use, or anti-Semitism was rather anti-Semitic, and then there is a camp that is anti-democratic, anti-emancipatory, for not only Jews but generally, but uses anti-Semitism as the code kind of by which then everyone understands that they're part of this camp. So this is kind of very abridged version of this. But it really opened up sort of the way historians started to think, included sort of the way that anti-Semitism operated and had political effects, right? Beyond the narrow focus on political parties as such, and maybe even parliaments and political venues as such. Volkov also is like a new generation of Israeli historians at this point, right? Before that, it was mostly immigrants and then some Germans, right, in the US and UK and some others as well. But at this point, she and others kind of often the daughters and children of immigrants themselves kind of who start coming of age and asking questions, writing history. She's also growing in one of the first sort of women, there's some more before, Zamashta and others kind of to publish in the Leo Baeck. And we can see, and this is kind of wanted to focus here, like the 80s are really this moment at which also then slowly women's issues, women as a gender, as a category sort of make their way into German Jewish history as well. And also by way of communal politics into politics more properly. It takes some time until really sort of full on politics or parliamentary politics and gender are discussed together. But by way of thinking about the communal politics and the contribution of women and women's organization in that, sort of they start to appear in the Leo Baeck. And outside of the Leo Baeck, sort of in German Jewish studies more generally, and Marion Kaplan is one of the people who's very prominent here, and she has in 1982, right, she writes the seminal article on Jewish women's place in Imperial Germany. And I put the 2001 yearbook next to it to show right, the trends on this. On the one hand, we still have a certain element of sort of not big man history, but thinking about it like the age of Metternich. It's a little bit more broadly constructed, but a focus on this and the Metternich and the Rothschilds, for example, it's kind of is much more reminiscent in certain ways of early publications of the Leo Baeck Institute. But then also a greater concern here to read gender and the boundaries of Jewish community, not narrowly on politics maybe, but actually the other thing that happens as being part of the cultural terms more generally, there are more and more ways, right, in which politics become part of other aspects of German Jewish history, or vice versa, other aspects of German Jewish history are considered political as well. And we can think about sort of how that changes. Like everything is political. From the 1870s on, we'll see actually fewer sections because the Leo Baeck Institute also itself, the yearbook was organized often in thematic sections, as you can see here, that are sort of on politics with a capital P. There was a much greater concern in the 60s and 70s on Jews as voters, Jews as public politicians. Anna Tamburger, who himself had been a social democratic politician and bureaucrat and state service, had been one of the driving sort of forces in writing about these things. By 2007, right, I'm sort of there's another noteworthy shift. I just kind of looked at it when I was looking through it, namely this other Germans and Jews, right, which sort of is an inversion of Jews and Other Germans, which was a famous book by Till van Raden in 2000. That also thinks about the place of Jews in German society more in a slightly different term. Terminology is another thing that really, in this thinking of emancipation, the political stakes of it, that changes over time. So we assimilation, integration, acculturation, kind of these different terms that are being used and have different connotations to it, but also whether you use German Jewry, Jews in Germany, German Jews, or here other Germans and Jews, as opposed to Jews and, Germans as different, which, thinking about a political social history, right, what Raden does there is kind of to understand them in a much more integrated fashion into their surroundings, sort of that still ask the question of emancipation and political participation, but without sort of them being the only hyphenated part of that society, but essentially arguing that many had sort of Germans and others had differently kind of hyphenated ideologies or identities, so to speak. Here, just like look at the question of curation, right? Sort of terminology that I mentioned. We have someone else talking about early modern period as sort of the way, maybe another aspect of the historiography and how it changes, kind of what is the focus. Geographically speaking, it's really Central Europe. I mean, that was the standard from the beginning, German-speaking lands. There were quite a few articles on Austro-Hungarian politics, Bohemian politics, every once in a while. Polish, particularly sort of during the First World War occupation. But by and large, really until the 1980s, there's very little on German, Jewish participation in politics or influence on politics outside of Central Europe. So be it by immigration to and then roles in the US or in Britain or in Mandated Palestine and Israel, it really is focused on the period until destruction, right? Sort of there's, I think the first time, right, as I said, the section dedicated on post-war politics only comes in 1991. And then on the question of restitution. So very much kind of still a kind of the political question is one that links back to the time period of emancipation. But by the 2010s, slowly like post-war German Jewish history and politics become part of the historiography as such, right? So the archives have been open for quite some time at this point, obviously. But it shifts right from this initial understanding that really the question to be understood and the politics to be understood are the ones from emancipation to destruction, also to think about the political history and the history kind of after 1945, which then opens up kind of other kind of political identities. You can see here with the Frebert's article on political choices among East German Jewish intellectuals, right? Sort of in question of communism after 1945, what kind of political choices are being made there. And so there's a different political trajectory than maybe the dominant liberal one that for the most part also the founding members of the Institute had ascribed to. Can see here kind of the way also that politics becomes ever more encompassing. Also the acculturation is the term used more frequently. This is again from the scientific sort of series of publications. That masculinity, for example, and the construction of masculinity in conservative circles or in the military, right, become parts of the interest of studying German Jewish experiences, the experience of Jews in war. And this is sort of covered also outside of Derek Penzler, right, where it writes an important book about the Jewish soldier. Right, it's a question of agency in that, and not only as part of sort of quote unquote liberal politics, that finds its way into German Jewish history as such. And maybe in the Q&A we can also talk a little bit more about the questions of sort of Lacrimose history or not, and where that actually maps onto the writing of post-war German Jewish history and at what point it changes. Or see here Robin Judd's book article, which became a book later, Jewish political behavior and the Schechtfrage. So like the politics here, sort of Shechita, ritual slaughter. And I'm just going to end here on a very recent issue and kind of the way, again, that politics have evolved, right? The question of agency is one that has come to the fore. You can see it spread also beyond the realm only of Central Europe in this context as well. We see something here, Palestine, Mandated Palestine at the point of running the port of Tel Aviv. Some economic history, questions of memory and agency in national belonging. So memory studies make their way into, which really is an article on the politics of Weimar, right? And sort of national identity in that sense. And something that's dear to my heart, as you've heard from Magda when she introduced me, questions of emotions in modern German Jewish history or in Jewish history more generally. And I want to end here like the last article I had from a 2021 one, which is one that is really a bit more directly focused on politics, which is something, as I said earlier, it's harder to find on the Bitburg affair, which was the visit of Ronald Reagan, and at that point the German Chancellor Kohl to a military cemetery at Bitburg, 1985. So on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the German capitulation, that also had the graves of SS soldiers among them. which kind of then raised the question whether or not it should go there. In the end, kind of Reagan, the compromise was that Reagan would also go to Bergen-Belsen to commemorate the liberation of the camp there. But it sparked then the activism and really sort of a more prominent argument than others, sort of the activism, political activism of the post-war German Jewish community in Frankfurt in particular, but beyond that as well, which in some ways, right, brings together large-scale international politics and domestic politics and Jewish communal politics, so all the three, in a way, levels of what politics means that I mentioned in the beginning. But it's also somewhat reminiscent of some of the early articles that had dealt, for example, with the role of Jewish lobbying and communities in the Congress of Berlin on behalf there, actually, on Romanian Jews and sort of the question of anti-Semitism there. So it's a bit like you can see certain trends in the questions of how politics are being addressed, right? We've moved away from the predominant focus on individuals, mostly males, of high politics, and the chronological focus from really emancipation as a political project towards its destruction also as a political project into the post-war and also kind of politics outside of Central European lands. But on the other hand, actually, German Jewish history, and when it came to politics, precisely because it was a position or history of a minority, was, I think, I'm always very attuned to the way that politics was done outside of the sort of narrow corridors of political power and within society or sort of cultural aspects as well. So I want to end it sort of here, and I'll be very open, and I'm going to stop the screen share to, yeah, take questions.
Okay.
Anyone.
Thank you, Philip, for walking us through the very fascinating aspect of the historiography. And I will begin now with the questions. It seems like we still have a good 20 minutes for the questions. However, and I would also like to remind our audience that there is still enough time to ask your question and type it in the Q&A box. So I have actually, my first question is, how's the relationship between the way political history was covered in the yearbook and the wider German history?
So I think I try to address this a little bit also when I related it to Blackburn. I think the main difference really is that sort of German Jewish history, right, in the yearbook was very much, almost always had Jews as actors within them, right? Sort of there are certain parts about politics that were covered like that affected Jews, right? There's a big part of the Third Reich, obviously, as well, and sort of anti-Semitic politics in Treitschke. But sort of in German history more generally, even when it was concerned with anti-Semitism, and I think that's true to some extent even until today, Jews by and large appear as victims, right? Sort of, and not necessarily as agents or actors of their own fate. There are then, there are crossovers and connections, and you can really see how I try to trace this a little bit. Sort of actually Leo Baeck and Jewish historians reach out to German historians, both of German descent, but elsewhere as well, and try to bring them in. So there are issues also where Ian Kershaw, for example, one of the preeminent historians of the Third Reich, publishes actually the Leo Baeck, or Rürup or others. But there is a certain distance, I want to say, that still remains today, generally between at least sort of German Jewish historiography or Jewish history and sort of German history on the other hand. I think the same is true if you were thinking of British history or French history, maybe. So, I mean, that's the other kind of point. We always have to see to what extent it's similar or different in other kind of national historiographies. I think trying to think where I was recently, where the question was asked, I think it was a Penn. So how the representation, like if you think about American history, if sort of the role of Jews in American history on the one hand, on the other hand, American history and Jewish history, sort of what the relationship between the two, and supposedly, right, sort of American history now is more and more written without sort of the presence of Jews in them, whereas Jewish history concerned with it. So I think that there are some parallels to other parts maybe as well, but that would be the short, not so short, slightly convoluted answer.
And what about the themes that were or are not covered at all?
I think, I mean, I try to, gender is much more becoming part of it in emotions, but I think, for example, queer history is interestingly kind of absent from it. So I think I should look through it again, but when I went through it, I think there's nothing on Magnus Hirschfeld, for example. So if you think about sexual politics, right, that's, I mean, they're sort of partly on women's history, but not so much beyond that. Emotions are starting to make their way into, right, the politics, as we have seen. So there's certain, you know, turns, right, that may not fully be present yet, even though once I started looking more closely, like some of them are clearly sort of emerging. And I think one of the things where it's actually on the forefront is, for example, migration studies, where again, for obvious, you know, reasons, because of the histories of those who founded the Leo Baeck and you know, the subject of German Jewish history. But there are certain parts where really kind of Jewish studies is very much at the avant-garde of sort of historiographical writing. Yeah.
And you also mentioned this Lachrymose history, the Leidenschaft-Geschichte, which is, of course, a very interesting aspect in the Jewish history, and also what Leo Baeck Institute is doing stands to some part as the opposite to the Leidenschaft-Geschichte, as we always also promote not only the 12 years of the history,
Right.
but much wider look on the history. So and also the Jewish and non-Jewish exchange, cultural exchange, and different influences, mutual influences. So could you talk about this a little bit?
I think it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, right, that the German Jewish history is very, you know, is very clearly a history. I mean, it ends in, again, sort of, if I go back to the initial brief, it ends in destruction, right? Sort of, that's the, you know, it's over. And at the same time, the brief is also initially to have some level of showing the achievements of German Jewish history, but it's also a very live debate within the pages of the Leo Baeck yearbook, really until, I mean, live, I'm just thinking about a discussion about the Zentralverein and whether or not it was misguided, and, you know, they eluded themselves and they should have known better, and it can't be seen as, you know, until the 1980s. So in 88, there's like a back and forth, 87, 88, over a series of articles, whether or not, with then letters, essentially kind of, that was a format that existed, at least, sort of, not letters to the editor, but sort of letters to the authors by other historians, whether or not one can describe the Zentralverein's history as one of success, right? Because it became influential, it organized German Jewry, it had all these sort of brilliant intellectuals part of it, etc. Or if it really was a story of failure because they were completely deluded and misguided and should have known better from the beginning. So there's and really it would be, it's almost that history is almost shameful, right? So that was another view of it, and it goes really back and forth. So even the task of describing sort of the successes and heights of German Jewish history, which was very much part of the paper, not the paper, of the different articles, and against Lachrymose history, is sort of disputed from the very beginning too, right? Sort of as actually not being the right mode of telling that story. Because again, one should have understood from the beginning, and it's not an aberration. That's kind of, I think, partly also where the Volkov article I referred to, I mean, it looks at anti-Semitism rather than sort of on the Jewish side in this context. But it too asks the question, like, where are the continuities and the discontinuities, right? At which point does the history flip? At which point is anti-Semitism so predominant in German society that really at this point maybe one should have known better, right? Sort of, is there a point in which this happens or not? And she's like, well, there are camps, right, which adopt this, but it doesn't doom German history per se already at this point. And so I think that's kind of where the journal tries to, over its time, navigate it. Sort of, is it lachrymose, is it not lachrymose, right? Sort of, other moments of real success, and then at something shifts, right? Sort of, and then everything goes down the hill, or was it really sort of endangered, fragile from the very beginning? And all these successes were kind of temporary, and there was anti-Semitism all along, right? So that's and I think that's still, I mean, now less so, but I think that was kind of where the debates within the journal happened very much.
Okay, thank you. And now I have a question from the chat, actually. Is there an overall trajectory of normalizing or integrating Jewish history into German history in this subfield? And also, and do internal Jewish politics ever show up? So those are actually two questions.
Right.
Yeah.
So for the last one, very much so, right? I mean, a large part of the, and I talked a little bit about communal politics, but not sort of to the extent maybe I could have. A large part of the articles are actually on intercommunal politics, right? Sort of, be it sort of formally elections, be it religious politics, like different strands, be it sort of particularly, and that's, I sort of, when I think about when the first publication of that happened, I could go through it again. 60s and 70s would be on Zionism and sort of the kind of question of Zionism within German Jewish communities prior to 1933 or even 1938. So the internal politics are very much part and continue to be part, right, of both the historiography more generally and the publications of the Leo Baeck Institute. I would say, so I want to say German Jewish history always had to consider itself as part of larger German history, right? I mean, sort of that's part of the, I mean, if I go back to the very beginning, the programmatic article by Speer, right? Sort of the understanding like this was Jewish history as part of this larger German history that affected it. On the other way around, as I like in response to Magda's question earlier on, I think for the longest time it wasn't, right? There was German history that after 1945, at some point, the 60s and 70s was, with a new sort of generation of historians, very much concerned with anti-Semitism and the coming of the Third Reich and trying to explain this gets you all the special path. But Jewish history is not really part of that. Right? It's a history of anti-Semitism, where Jews are then objects, but not necessarily historical subjects. I want to say that has changed somewhat over the last 20 years, maybe, so that if you were to look at histories of, for example, constitutionalism, find stuff about Preuss and Jelinek, etc. And maybe some also reflection. I'm thinking here of the recent sort of Jelinek, who was one of the main constitutional thinkers of the empire, or then Preuss, there's a good biography of Preuss that just came out, that do reflect sort of on them, not only as constitutional thinkers, but also on their, the fact that they were Jewish and what that might have played a role in it, not to a huge extent, but to some extent. So there's some integration of that. But I want to say for the most part, they remain, like German history remains somewhat separate to that, even though there are two, I think, sort of the general thinking about German history as one of movement, of migration, of immigration, of different, hyphenated identities, etc. sort of has opened it up more generally kind of to integrating Jews in a more natural way, right, than might have been the case in the past, right, because it's no longer this monolithic German history.
Do you see any connection between the rising popularity of social history in the 60s and the change the way scholars understand anti-Semitism or started understanding since then?
Certainly. I mean, I think it was and you can see that sort of it becomes, so for better and when there are pushbacks then to initially kind of it very much with social history becomes structural, right? So the understanding, the attempt to explain it is through ways of right, certain classes, for example, the artisanal classes were disadvantaged by modernity, and they then, as a class, right, sort of objected to Jews who were seen as a class. Right? Sort of, there's a class and social structure understanding of it that becomes a little bit sort of disembodied, which links to some, if you think about Volkov, for example, like, yes, like the Weltanschauung, this kind of worldview you would use as anti-Semitism, also tries to abstract it from Jews you might encounter, right, sort of one-on-one, and it's not about hatred and emotion, supposedly at least, but it's really about giving meaning to the world and the structures of modernity, and then blaming it on sort of the abstract notion of Jews. So there's a certainly sort of that level of understanding, which then receives pushback to say, well, actually, there's a lot of emotion still in this and hate, and not everyone really who's an anti-Semite is part of the social structures, and why do they explain it that way? But it moves out of, sort of a more social I mean, it has psychological elements to it, but sort of earlier periods that were either focused on religion or personal experience, individual figures, right, who drove it. And those are more social, large-scale social structures that determine sort of ideology. So there's that. I mean, and again, so it overlaps, I think, with what I said about the way that the focus on individual people as representatives of politics changes to, larger classes and structures of society, within that as well. So I think there's a change in the understanding of anti-Semitism.
Okay. And maybe just a last question, and for those that joined later, just a reminder, this is a lecture series. The next lectures will happen in the following months. So the last question to Philipp, since this is the first lecture and he has the privilege to open the entire series. So what do you think, how do politics relate to the other fields that are going to be covered in the remaining lecture series? And just a reminder, we will also cover economics, religion, gender, migration. Early modern is actually the next lecture in June. So Philipp, what do you think about that?
I mean, on some level, like I was privileged to start out because I could just kind of set the terms. But I mean, in some ways, everything can be political, right? So that we can think about how, like, now in politics, I mean, I try to focus on the more sort of high politics, at least initially, even though, and I've talked about some others too. But arguably, right, religion and the question, for example, of what I mentioned earlier, ritual slaughter, right, sort of becomes a highly politicized issue, or maybe is a politicized issue and then invades religion, right, sort of in that way around. I think politics has the ability to touch all aspects of life. And if you think about chronology, I guess, anyhow, you know, early modern politics, early modern history, have elements of politics and also other histories. But if you're thinking about I guess the way that society is structured by laws and other things, right, which are eventually determined by politics, you get the result anywhere. But so, which I hope, right, because that's one of the things when I look through the different articles and try to establish, like, what is it really I'm going to talk about? Like, what are the politics? I try to focus on the ones that are really kind of politics with a capital P to some extent, at least. But arguably, I think there are other areas around sort of that will be, all the others are some ways touched by this maybe too. So hopefully maybe this has set the ground for some of the later discussions when we think about what the ideas about history and history of politics were for the founding generation and then the ones that followed.
Thank you, Philipp, for the wonderful presentation and answering our questions. And to the entire audience, please join us for the next lecture that will happen also on Wednesday, on June 11th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.